This is The Secret Lies Within, and I'm John Trevelyan. For this show, we're going to hear a reading by Sarah Wragg of her story, The Festival Line. Sarah's part of the Talliston Writers' Circle, and she's been dabbling with fiction writing for years, but she's still ready to expand to new horizons. She's not sure whether she's found her genre, but she's always feeling in an experimental mood. She's written short stories, very short stories, longer stories, novels, and she's recently been inspired into flexing her poetry muscles.
The Festival Line. Trafalgar Square tube station is one of the deepest in London. Its poorly lit platform has been marked only by the bright mustard stripe of the Festival Line, otherwise it's been left virtually untouched for years. It's one of London's dirtiest, gloomiest, most depressing places to be. Even the beggars and buskers steer clear of it. The atmosphere of the station doesn't inspire anyone to charity. They're too busy taking pity on themselves for being in such a God-forsaken place. It was late one August night and the westbound platform was filling up with homebound revellers. Some had been to the theatre, some for meals, some just drinking. They stood in pairs, groups and singly, waiting for the next train. According to the digital display hanging from the ceiling, this would be 3 minutes. A small group of Japanese girls stood gossiping together by the edge of the platform. One of them said something that made them all giggle behind their hands. One of the girls turned away so she could compose herself, and, as she did so, glimpsed something out of the corner of her eye. Shrieking with horror, she stepped back from the platform edge, but her anxiety was unheeded by her friends, who burst into peals of laughter. People standing near the girl looked towards the cause of her terror, and most of them smiled too. The girl shuffled nervously back to the platform edge and looked down, giggling at herself in embarrassment as she took a closer look. 5 or 6 tiny mice were foraging for crumbs in the dirt-black concrete trench beneath the shiny rails. It was impossible to count them accurately as they were scuttling to and fro in such a frenetic, haphazard way. Other people began to take notice of the mice and idled away the time by watching their antics below the overhanging platform's edge. One young man was eating a hot dog, so he broke off little pieces of bread and threw them down. The mice approached nervously, running towards the crumbs, then darting away as though the bread was booby-trapped. One finally plucked up enough courage to approach the bread, and had just been brave enough to put a piece in its mouth when the digital sign on the roof announced, "Next train approaching." The ground began to vibrate, gently at first, but the noise and the quivering of the ground became more and more pronounced as the train grew closer. Even though this happened every 3 or 4 minutes throughout the day, the mice seemed startled by this mini-earthquake. They scattered pointlessly in all directions, scurrying hither and thither in a frightened attempt to escape, even though this huge metal dragon had no power to hurt them. The train pulled into the station, stopped, disgorged some passengers, and then swallowed up the people from the platform. The doors closed and the train moved away, rumbling into the distance, leaving the empty station behind. Gradually the platform began to fill again, people groaning with frustration when they saw they had to wait 9 minutes for the next train, the penultimate of the day. As time ticked by, the platform became more crowded, but the routine was the same. Some people were reading tomorrow's papers, others talking quietly amongst themselves, the rest gazing at the mice, marvelling at their speed and the pointlessness of their existence. The woman standing in the middle of the platform, Fiona, was one of these people. She didn't like the small animals, but felt safe enough to look because of the long drop separating them from her feet. That night she'd been out for a drink with a friend from work and was now feeling slightly drunk and incredibly sleepy. If she could have afforded a taxi, she would definitely have taken one. She didn't particularly want to spend the next 20 minutes or so in a hot, crowded, airless carriage, and certainly didn't relish the dark 10-minute walk home at the other end. Her tired thoughts began to wander as she gazed at the mice. Then her subconscious took control of her daydreaming and whisked her back to an incident she'd have preferred to have forgotten about. She thought of the disgusting white rats her brother's best friend used to keep when they were children. Her brother had borrowed one of them and hid it under her duvet. It was still there when she got into bed that night. A small shiver shook her shoulders as she remembered it, so vividly in fact that even now she could almost feel it brush against her feet. Finally, the train began to rumble towards the station. As usual, the mice scurried in their panic, but this time was different. Something had frightened them more than the train. Not only were they all running purposefully in a straight line, they were also running in the same direction, which was as far away as possible from the very spot on which Fiona was standing. But the behaviour of the mice went unheeded by the people on the platform, who were all watching the train as it neared the station. The first indication of it was the reflection of its headlights glinting on the tracks. Then the train itself came into view. As the front of it shot out of the tunnel and into the station, Fiona felt something brush against her foot. Instinctively she squealed and leapt back, bumping into a middle-aged man in a suit who was reading the Daily Mail. She looked down and saw something pale disappear beneath the platform. "Oh, my God, a rat!" she screamed. But her voice was drowned by the noise of the train, and there was nothing she could do. The train had come to a halt and passengers were shoving past each other onto it in the hope of getting a seat. A couple of men in their early 20s got into the next carriage. "Did you see that?" said one. "No, what?" "Looked like a hand under the train." "No, it couldn't have been." "Well, that's what it looked like." "Nah, you must be seeing things." "I suppose." And the incident was forgotten. The train drew out of the station, leaving behind a platform empty of people except for one old man. He was sitting on a bench in the recess in the wall, chuckling to himself. The man was small, skinny and weaselly-looking, with thinning white hair which could no longer hide the large liver spots that had formed on his scalp. His weathered skin and greyish stubble gave him an air of one who hasn't seen a bar of soap in quite some time. His shabby raincoat and muddy shoes merely added to that impression. He rested his arthritis-gnarled hands on a walking stick propped between his knees. His rheumy old eyes twinkled with excitement as he studied the spot midway down the platform where Fiona had been standing. He shifted forwards on the bench and watched the scene before him, keeping an eye on the display board to check how much time was left before the last train arrived. He was anticipating that event like a child looking forward to Christmas. A few stragglers hurried onto the platform, relieved they hadn't missed the last train home. A young couple caught the old man's attention. They were standing about halfway down the platform and had their arms clasped around each other's waists. Dave and Ruth had had a very good evening, which began with a chaste and clumsy kiss outside the Odeon in Leicester Square. They'd gone to see the latest blockbuster movie, which everyone was raving about. They'd paid a fortune to see it, this being Leicester Square, but they'd hardly taken any notice of what was happening on the screen. Instead, their excitement came from the way their friendship had playfully, thrillingly become an embryonic relationship. First, David let his hand fall over the armrest, brushing his fingers against Ruth's leg as he tested the water, seeing how long she'd allow him to keep them there. Ruth, not knowing whether or not Dave's hand was there by accident or design, moved very slightly closer towards him so that his fingers were lightly touching both thighs. His touch caused a flutter in her stomach, and she glanced at him at the same time as he glanced at her. They smiled shyly, and when they caught each other's eye, bashful, they looked away, blushing happily in the dark. As their eyes returned to the screen, their hands searched for each other. They clasped, fingers caressing palms, and holding on to each other for the rest of the film. After that, they went for a drink, then had coffee in a late-night cafe, both reluctant to end the evening. But then they realised it was later than they thought and they had to hurry or miss the last train home. Dave escorted Ruth onto the platform, would see her safely onto the train, then go back up to Trafalgar Square where he'd get the night bus home. It would mean an extra half-hour on his journey time, but it would be worth it. The old man saw Ruth put her mouth close to Dave's ear and breathe soft, warm words to him. He smiled and they kissed briefly, tearing their lips away just long enough to gaze adoringly into each other's eyes. "Take a long look," the old man muttered to himself. "It might just be your last." He began to feel the gentle vibration under the floor as the train grew nearer and nearer. He worked himself up into a quiver of anticipation. He didn't need to see the mice flee from the part of the platform where the couple were standing to know that they were doing so, and he began to chuckle to himself. As the train got nearer, the man's giggles turned into a triumphal whoop as he saw a white object appear from beneath the platform. "I suppose I'll have to say good night then," said Dave. "Well," Ruth hesitated before she continued speaking, but didn't finish her sentence because of the surprised frown which suddenly crossed Dave's face. He felt something cold grab at his leg. "What the?" He looked down and saw a pale grey hand grabbing his ankle. Dave quickly stepped back, shaking his leg and trying to loosen the grip, but the hand didn't let go, and as he tried to draw away, he saw an arm emerge from beneath the overhanging platform. It obviously belonged to a fit, muscular man, though nobody could see who it was. He was hiding beneath the platform's lip. The people who'd been standing near Dave saw the arm, and afterwards they all remarked on how pale the skin was. As the train rushed closer and closer, Dave felt the hand grip him tighter and tighter. As the machine roared out of the tunnel, he felt a sharp tug on his leg. The man underneath the platform was trying to pull him into the train's path. Dave bellowed with fear and rage. Ruth screamed for help, trying to tug him to safety by his sleeve, kicking ineffectually at the arm at the same time. Some of the other passengers were quick to realise what was happening. They ran over to the couple, grabbing hold of Dave and pulling him away from the platform. By now he'd fallen to the floor and had braced his free leg against the ground, desperately pushing against it. The others tried to wrench him away from the approaching train, but the vice-like grip of the unknown man was keeping him in its path. When the front of the train was just a few feet away, Dave felt himself being yanked with a superhuman strength towards the track. He yelled in fear as his body hurtled towards the electric dragon. The driver saw him and jammed on the brakes, but he'd been too anxious to finish his run as quickly as possible and was coming into the station too fast. As the train's brakes squealed with ear-splitting rage, the people who were holding on to Dave made one final heave-to. At the last second, just when they thought it was too late, the hand's grip loosened and it let go of its prey, causing everyone to fall backwards onto the safety of the grimy concrete. The ensuing stunned silence was broken by the manic chuckles of the old man. He could hardly contain his glee, and he slapped his thigh helplessly as though he'd just heard the world's funniest joke. His laugh echoed and magnified as it skimmed across the walls, then swirled around the arched ceiling, circling down to envelop and taunt the dazed people, spiralling ever louder, ever more gleeful. As his mania subsided, people began to regain their senses. A profound sense of shock set in. A frantic search began to look for the man who tried to force the young lover to his death. Within minutes, the station was full of staff and police who took control and calmed everyone down. The tearful young couple, after giving their statement, were dispatched in a police car, together, to Dave's flat. Everyone else had to wait for the staff to check the track before allowing the train to pull into the station fully so they could finally go home. And not long after the last train had pulled out of the station, the only people left were a couple of policemen, a few staff members, and the old man. "Come on, sir. Time to go. The show's over." Derek was the station supervisor. It was his job to make sure there were no passengers left in the station before they locked the front gates for the night. "He won't go away until he's got one," the old man warned. There was an air of menace in his voice which Derek found very unsettling. "Who are you talking about?" "Him, under the platform. He's come back to get his revenge. Been expecting him for years." Derek had a sinking feeling that the old man wouldn't leave until he'd told his story, so he sat down on the bench in the alcove and hoped the old man would at least get it over and done with quickly. "Go on then," said Derek, "but you'll get me into trouble. Every time I'm late home, my wife thinks I'm with another woman." "Don't worry, this tale's worth it." The old man giggled and pointed to the track with his walking stick. "They renamed this line after the war. Thought they'd ponce things up a bit in time for the Festival of Britain. Couldn't afford new holes in the ground in those days, so they gave it all a lick of paint, a new name, and bingo, another example of how great the British Empire was." "So what's that got to do with the man under the platform?" "It was 1949 or 1950, something like that. The war had been over a few years, but we were still suffering for it, shortages, rationing and the like. The festival was supposed to make us feel better, but we were still looking over our shoulders at the past. Well, Trafalgar Square was the first station on the festival line to get its spit and polish, so they made a big fuss about it. Decided to have an official opening by some distant relative of the king. Oh, it was jolly enough, a lot of people there, a small brass band. Made quite a noise in here, I can tell you." He paused, nodding his head in time to the imaginary music. "And?" said Derek. "Have you heard of the Nuremberg trials?" Of course I have," said Derek. for war criminals from the Second World War. Well, they were only for the most senior of Hitler's lot, but we were still looking out for the little Nazis, the ones that got away. Stories would pop up from time to time about the ones who'd escaped justice. There was one in particular folks took against because they'd seen a photograph of him. Can't remember his name, but I can see the photo clear as day. Blonde bugger he was, with deep-set eyes and eyebrows that met in the middle. Would have been a handsome young fellow if it wasn't for the way he looked at you. In the picture he was standing in front of a pile of Jews he'd just shot in a concentration camp. Proud of himself he was, standing there like he'd just hunted a man-eating lion. Well, you can imagine what the British public thought of that. Bastard, muttered Derek. And worse, said the old man. Anyway, the grand opening of the station, he continued. There we all were, waving flags and cheering the king's distant relative, when a train pulled into the station and people got out, including a blonde-haired man with deep-set eyes. He was too rude for his own good, and as he elbowed people out the way, he spoke German. Anyway, one lady heard him, so she took a good look at him. She thought of that awful photo, with the blonde German monster standing in front of those poor people, and put two and two together. She may have made 4, she may have made 5. It made no difference. It's him, she cries. The crowd takes a lead and turns very nasty. The minor royal was ushered out PDQ, I can tell you, and the Rozzers were brought in. Well, they were blowing their whistles all the way down the stairs, but couldn't get through until it was too late. You see, the crowd decided to take the law into their own hands. These days they'd call it people power or something like that, but in those days it was mob rule. You know, why wait for the law to take control when you can do it yourself right now? Much more satisfying for them what takes part, eh? He gave Derek a mischievous wink. In a nutshell, what happened was another train came into the station. Those that were close to the platform's edge gave the Nazi a shove and... splat! The old man rammed his fist into the palm of his other hand. The crack echoed around the empty station. That's where he fell, he continued, nodding at the spot where the ghostly white hand had grabbed Dave and tried to pull him into the path of the train. I reckon he's come back for his revenge. Derek whistled in awe at the story. And was he? Was he what? A Nazi war criminal? He might have been, might not have been. Who's to say? The echoing silence of the station was broken by the rumble of an empty train returning to its night's resting place. As the train drew nearer, Derek's attention was caught by something moving. It was about halfway down the platform. He stood up and walked towards it and saw that it was the German's arm, grasping out wildly and blindly for a victim to pull in front of the train. The other members of staff left on the station had also seen it. They stood staring open-mouthed and wide-eyed. As the train thundered into the station and sped past, the arm disappeared back under the platform. "Did you see that?" Derek whispered fearfully. The others merely nodded as they continued to stare at the place the arm had appeared. Derek walked cautiously to the platform's edge and knelt down. He leant over, peering into the gloom to see if anyone was hiding underneath. "There's nothing there," he said. The old man burst into peals of cackling laughter. "He's still waiting, you can be sure of that. The only time he'll disappear for good is when he's done it to someone else. Eye for an eye, you mark my words." The old man stood slowly and made his way towards the exit. "Time I was off," he said as he shuffled away, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Derek and the night staff stood staring at each other for a while. Another train approached the station and the arm appeared once more. It groped around for anyone unfortunate enough to be in the vicinity. Derek, who was still kneeling nearby, stood quickly and retreated to the safety of his colleagues. As the train pulled away and rumbled into the distance, they could hear the old man's laughter echoing from the depths of the pedestrian tunnels. "I'm going home," said Derek, "and I'm going to get me home brew out the airing cupboard and drink the bloody lot." But before he left, he took a whiteboard marker pen from his pocket and drew a semicircular line around the area where the Nazi's arm had appeared. Then he wrote, "Do not stand in front of this line when train approaches the station," beside it. The next day, the Evening Standard published a couple of paragraphs about the incident with the lovers. Even though the story was hidden away on page 5, online it became a sensation. That evening, Trafalgar Square tube station was heaving with sightseers, all eager to get a glimpse of the cold grey arm. But nothing happened till nearly midnight, by which time most of them had gone home. However, the ghost hunters who'd bothered to wait were well rewarded for their patience. At 10 to 12, a train drew closer to the station. Drivers had been instructed to slow down before they got to Trafalgar Square in case a German reappeared and was successful in getting hold of an unsuspecting passenger. This train was no exception and approached the station at a snail's pace. "Look!" A woman was pointing towards a stop behind Derrick's felt-tip pen line. A muscular white arm was reaching out in vain for something to grasp, the fingers struggling against the platform floor, trying to reach further afield, but again with no luck. The train driver braked and his vehicle came to a halt about 10 feet away, giving the German plenty of time to find a victim. The sightseers shuffled closer to get a better look, but none dared to cross Derrick's festival line. One man had been drinking a can of Coke and, ignoring some of the women's pleas not to do it, went nervously towards the arm. Keeping his feet outside the line, the man offered the Coke to the ghost. The can was greedily snatched from his hand, causing the man to jump swiftly backwards. The hand turned the can around as though contemplating it, and then threw it into the trench beneath the rails, and he continued his search for a victim. The station supervisor, anxious not to allow too many hold-ups to the service, motioned to the driver to pull further into the station. As the train began to move, the arm disappeared again. The German didn't reappear until a fortnight later, by which time the film crews and photographers had given up hope of seeing it and moved on. Although the most dedicated ghost hunters were occasionally rewarded by the arm's search for revenge, the intervals between its appearances were lengthy and unpredictable. As the reputation of the station spread, people began to avoid using it. They preferred to walk to one of the other stations, all of which were modernised, brightly lit, and had no ghostly secrets to boast of. In fact, the number of people using Trafalgar Square station trailed off till it was virtually negligible. London Transport eventually used this as an excuse to close it down. They even bricked up the platform so passengers were no longer aware they were speeding past the old station. But for many years afterwards, train drivers continued to report sightings of a ghostly arm reaching through the wall, groping around for an unwitting passenger, and vainly trying to fulfil its destiny.
The Secret Lies Within was produced by me, John Trevelyan, with the support of Talliston House Gardens. It's a project where ordinary people have taken an ordinary place and transformed it and themselves into something quite extraordinary. Find out more at talliston.com.